This week on Physio Foundations, I'm talking to Dr Brooke Patterson from Trobe University and the Trobe Sports and Exercise Medicine Research Group. We're going to talk to her all about her background as a physiotherapist, a physiotherapy researcher, and then we're going to talk about her research into ACLs. Welcome back to the Physio Foundations podcast for another week, a podcast about the knowledge and skills that provide the foundation of expert clinical practice. So I'm really lucky on this podcast. We're 22, 23 episodes in so far, and I've had a bunch of really nice, high quality guests sharing their knowledge and expertise with me. And this week is no exception because I'm talking to Brooke Patterson from the Trobe Sports and Exercise Medicine Research Group, Trobe University. And we're talking to Zuzana Perraton, or Zuzana's co-hosting again, also from LASM and Perraton Physio. So welcome, Brooke, and welcome, Zuzana.
Thanks, Luke. Hi, Zuzana. Thanks for having me. You're doing a great job with the podcasts.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. It's great to have you on board because we had your work buddy, Matt King, on 2 episodes ago, and Zuzana and I had a chat to Matt and had a really nice conversation about his research. And so in a bit of a segue from his biomechanics research, where we spent a bit of time talking about comparing men and women and similarities and differences. And we're going to talk a bit later in this chat about some of your research with women and girls in sport. But before we do that, can you give us, everyone, a bit of a brief introduction to you and why you're such a good guest, why I'm so excited to get you on the podcast? So about your background and current interests.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Luke. So I'm a physiotherapist by trade. I worked for about 4 or 5 years in public and private settings and was kind of going down that sports physio pathway and kind of got to a crossroads, and I met Professor Kay Crosley and Dr Adam McColvenar, who were starting up this LASM research centre, and I thought, well, that sounds very cool. I want to be a part of that, and yeah, went down the PhD pathway. Before that, I'd actually suffered an ACL injury and had done a little bit of honours research. I'd had a little bit of a taste of it with Kate Webster and really enjoyed that. So, and yeah, did a PhD, and then I've been finished bit over 12 months now from that, and now doing full-time research role at La Trobe in injury prevention. On the side, throughout my PhD, I was also playing football in the AFLW, and then working a little bit as a physio, and now I'm doing some coaching. So I guess, yeah, I'm pretty lucky I get to combine my, sporting passions with my work at the moment.
Now, Zuzana, as usual, feel free to jump in here as the co-host. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
Well, I was just going to say, do you want to elaborate on your coaching? Because it's not just coaching at community level. I mean, this is someone that I look up to. Brooke, she's done her PhD. She's done some clinical. She has been an elite athlete. But what led you to the coaching?
Yeah, good question, Zuzana. I think always as a basketballer and then more recently football, I was always a bit of a student of the game, always a nerd through school. And yeah, I think that was no different in sport. And I like to understand how the game was played. And that was probably one of my strengths as a player, was providing that on-field leadership and direction and communication. So I think that, probably stood out. And when I finished up playing, the coaches were obviously happy to keep me around and help those younger players coming through. So, and I'm really enjoying it. I think it's the same in physio. You kind of think, you're not going to get the same kick from being on the sidelines as you are being out on the field, but you certainly do. You're part of the team, and if you've got a good team, then yeah, you're getting a lot of reward out of that.
A lot of stories are going to start with Kay and Adam. So Kay Crosley, your PhD supervisor, my PhD supervisor, and then founder of the LASM research group. And so there's so much going on there. And you mentioned your ACL injury, and then you had an honours project as well. Tell us a bit about that. So you've got a PhD which focused around ACL injuries, and you've had an ACL injury yourself and played in elite sport and are coaching in elite sport. Let's go back to your own personal experience. How did your ACL injury sort of shape your experiences and then your direction as a practitioner and a researcher?
Yeah, the ACL injury was halfway through my honours project, which was on ACLs, and I thought I should have got some extra marks for going through the process. But it was, really like good learning experience. It sucked at the time, but now looking back, you're right. It really has kind of shaped my career. And I think I was in 4th year physio, and I probably thought I knew what I was doing, but I certainly didn't, and made a few mistakes along the way. And that's probably helped guide some of my passions for the research as well. And I kind of self-guided a bit of my rehab and then got a little bit of help, but didn't. And that was obviously physically challenging, mentally challenging. And then going on to try and treat patients as well, seeing that. And then that kind of just drove me to want to be able to get better outcomes for people. So, and I really found at the end of my rehab experience going and participating in your study and Adam's study and doing the testing at Melbourne Uni, that was actually what kickstarted me to actually be like, oh, actually, I'm doing okay. I can get back to sport. I didn't think I was maybe, ready. And that, it gave me real confidence to get back into it. So I think that was probably subconsciously sparked a little bit of an interest in it, but it wasn't until 4 years later that I then came across Adam again when it was, coming up to the 5-year follow-up, and he twisted my arm to like, do you want to, run a study like this?
That's where we met. I was putting reflective markers all over you and about to get you to do hopping and jumping, and then had a really good conversation about because at the time you were doing your honours. I think at that time you'd published a whole bunch of papers during your honours. I think you're a bit of an overperformer there, and I think it was a memorable conversation that I remember. So you mentioned mistakes as well in your rehab. So if you had your ACL injury and surgery and rehab again, based on everything you know now from all your research and practice and coaching and playing, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I would definitely get more guidance. And for the physios listening in, if you ever have an injury, you should always go and see another professional and probably someone you don't know, because, just to get that feedback on where you're at and where your gaps are in your strength and your function and keep you accountable. But the biggest mistake I probably made is as soon as I was back playing basketball, I kind of stopped all the gym stuff, and which is a pretty common mistake. I think I was just, running, playing basketball, and then I ended up having like a kind of second meniscal repair came kind of, undone, and had to have that resected. So, but I think that was probably due to, not keeping up and getting those last little gains.
Yeah, so having that guidance and that unbiased measurement and assessment from someone you don't know who can tell you hard things as well. And probably one of those things would have been don't stop the gym based on all the research and everything we know now.
Yeah, and that's where some of, I guess Adam and yours and my research led to, is trying to understand, at that 1 year time point. So my PhD study was a longitudinal cohort following up people 5 years after their ACL reconstruction. And we also had data at 1 year and 3 years post-surgery. And we were trying to look at what were some of the factors at 1 year, which is that typical time when people have definitely stopped rehab, are returning to sport, and do some of those things, predict or have associations with worse outcomes in the future, whether they be early arthritis or, poor quality of life or reduced physical activity. And the main things that came out of the PhD work were that people with a higher body mass index, so perhaps people that had become less active and hadn't returned, and then also functional performance on some HOP tests was associated with some early osteoarthritis features, what we termed worsening. So we looked at MRIs at both time points and looked at the specific structures in the knee, like the cartilage, bone marrow lesions, osteophytes, meniscal lesions, and see whether they were degenerating in that kind of 4-5 year period.
Perfect. I mean, this is quite topical because on the weekend I was covering a football game and I was speaking to the sports docs and the other sports physios, and it was about ACLs, and unfortunately we did have a incident where an ACL injury had happened. But the question was, how do we rehab them, and should we go conservative versus surgical? All of those things that, obviously there's a lot of discussion about it. My sort of point was, when I see ACLs in the clinic, I'm always lucky enough that I often work in a sports medicine research centre. So I'll have other physios that have a special interest in ACLs. And so if I see someone with an ACL, I'm happy to do the initial bit, but I often will then refer them on to someone who pretty much specialises, because as you'd know and you just alluded to, it's a long journey with the rehab, whether you go conservative, whether you go surgical. And so for me, I've been, like I said, lucky enough to be able to refer these people on, because realistically in the clinic, you don't see a lot of them continually. So what would your advice be to, say, new grads in a clinic and they see an ACL? I mean, what should they do? What sort of resources could they go to?
Yeah, it's a great question, Zuzana. And I think, I'd kind of just started doing it and learning and probably making mistakes again as a clinician as you went. So I think they definitely need to reach out to their experienced clinicians around them, or reach out to people that they may know in the field that might be able to, also treat them might be a good way. So not just kind of handballing it, because they're not going to learn by doing that. So I would try and do some co-treating and access some of there's some really good clinical guidelines. There's lots of research in the ACL space. So some nice kind of easy to read clinical guidelines about the key assessment pieces you should be looking at and all the different elements of the rehab. I would also be tying into our exercise science professionals as well, if you're not confident in programming, strength, power, running programs, return to sport programs, and even doing some co-management with those professionals as well.
That's a really important point, that co-management and that multidisciplinary teams. But as Zuzana said, particularly a team that has a specialist in that team as well, someone that you can refer to or you're comfortable working with. You can't really work on your own. You can to a certain extent, but it's very limited what you can do. You have to work with other people, don't you?
Yeah. And as Zuzana said, it's a long journey. So for the patient themselves as well, to have different voices isn't necessarily a bad thing. So you kind of have to leave your ego behind and, accept that you might, have missed something, or you might not have thought about something for a while for that patient, and having a fresh set of eyes can help with that.
What are some resources just off the top of your head for those who perhaps don't work with people with ACL injury every day, and they heard you say there's some really good clinical guidelines and other resources? Where can we steer people? And if you don't have any off the top of your head, I can always put them in the show notes at the end as well.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't be able to reel off the authors, Luke, but
that's okay.
There's a handful of clinical guidelines that have been done in the last 6 years. And then there's the Melbourne Return to Sport Guide that Randall Cooper and Mick Hughes have put together. You should definitely check out Christian Barton and Danilo's Trek website. They have a lot of resources there as well. I did a pilot RCT in my PhD as well, which we kind of identified people that were at risk of these worse outcomes in the future at 12 months. Based on if they were, functioning poorly or had poor self-reported function and pain and symptoms. And we developed a little intervention, which included 8 different types of exercises, some education. So there's actually a website that we can link the listeners to as well, which have got all the education leaflets and the exercise videos for that as well. So
there we are. I put you on the spot, and I felt a little bit guilty as I was doing it. But then you've reeled off all these really nice resources. So we've got the Trek website. Mick and Randall have been on the podcast before and talked about their return to sport guidelines. There's other published guidelines that I can find and put in the show notes, and your pilot RCT with your website and resources. So there we go. If you're interested in ACLs and you feel like that's an area that you want to upskill in, stacks of stuff out there.
Yeah, and like Brooke said, I mean, obviously I don't just handball them. Like I do sort of work together a little bit, but mainly I like to, if there's someone that specialises in that particular field, and that's what they like seeing, I'm happy to, co-treat or get them to that, because there's always that bit where you've got that rehab and then you've got that strength and conditioning. And I know particularly in sports, that can be a bit blurred. And if you're able to sort of marry that together, so you end up doing a little bit of the strength and conditioning, and whether that's you and you keep going, or whether then you incorporate another professional, if you can sort of do that seamlessly, it can work really, really well. The issue is when, the rehab, you go really well, and then you just sort of go, okay, here you go, strength and conditioning, off they go to the gym and they do their own thing. And that's when they're either going to underload or overload. And then their return to sport becomes a little bit dicey. So like you had your experience.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So having that touch point back with the physio, I think is really important to make sure that the knees, staying quiet and doing some of those clinical assessment pieces as well is a good model.
And I guess the other thing, and you talk about Adam Colviner, and I think it's you as well that's part of the super knee. And if, ACLs is something that, the listener's thinking, I'd really like to get involved. Getting involved in research can be a really good way as well, in terms of finding out if they're looking for clinicians to be involved with certain research, because you always end up, it's the same with your prep to play, educating the clinicians, and you get so much great information. The other thing is you get a stream of these particular patients. So in the clinic, you might see one or two in, say, 6 months to a year, and then you go into a part of a research group, and you're one of the clinicians, and then you get to see, one every week or so. So that's another option. What do you think, Brooke?
Yeah, that's a great way to get involved and get a bit of a taste of research, as you said. So I would strongly encourage new grads out there to keep an eye on, whether it's LASM or other, sports medicine research groups. And, you might be able to be a participant, or you might be able to be a treating physio. The super knee trials are a great one as well. So it kind of led on from my PhD work. So, how I said that, people have got worse function, and that might lead to worse outcomes, but we don't actually know yet, and there's not much research around the world, as if you actually address the function and make people stronger, does that actually slow or delay or halt the progression of arthritis and deterioration in symptoms and quality of life? So that's what Adam's super knee project is going to look at, which is really exciting.
So that's Adam Colviner we mentioned before, and you do a quick Google Scholar search and you'll see plenty of research from Adam. And I'm going to put a link to all the nice resources and the trials and everything that you've said there in the show notes. So if you're listening to this on a run or a walk or in the car, don't look at the show notes. Keep doing your driving and your walking and running, but afterwards look them up, because you might as well follow up on these ideas if you're interested on them. So what about your work as a practitioner, as a physio, Brooke? So you've mentioned the importance of measuring, assessing function and considering people's structure of their knee. You mentioned really early in the conversation the mental as well as the physical contributions or problems that you can have during a knee rehab. So considering everything you know as a coach, former player, current athlete, I'm sure you're still playing sports, practitioner, researcher, all the good things you've done, where would you focus as a new grad now? What are the most important foundational knowledge and skills you think for a practitioner in the field that you're in?
Oh, asking the big hitting questions, Luke.
It's very broad though. You can sort of do whatever you want with it. It's sort of where do you put what skills and knowledge do you always take with you to work? You can't go to work without.
I think the biggest thing with any injury, and ACLs in particular, is that end stage rehab. So as soon as the patients feel like they can do most things, even if they might still have some of those outstanding deficits, which we know from the literature, even though people are back playing sport, they do still have those deficits. It's trying to value your skills as a practitioner in terms of your education and ongoing assessment, and not necessarily feeling like you need to be giving them a million different new fancy exercises every time that they come back, and having those longer term touch points to try and help that end stage and try and help that longer term joint health as well. That it's not just, get back to running and, I'm ready to return to sport and then that's it. And then I think probably my experience as an athlete and an injured athlete a lot of the time, and now a coach, is trying to talk to those people. And it's hard when you're in private practice you don't even know who these people are, or let alone how to kind of communicate with them. So it's trying to open up that dialogue with the athlete and the coach to try and bridge that gap between, as Zuzana said, that they've finished their gym and they're ready for this. But there's a lot of steps in between, which I think is where the crucial elements do lie in terms of preventing re-injury. And I love it now because I can kind of combine my physio skills with my coaching skills. And, definitely for football and basketball, I'd have to do a bit more research for other sports, but trying to think of things that athlete needs from a re-injury perspective, but also needs from a sport-specific perspective, and trying to merge the two. So I think as a clinician, you can just ask the person in front of you, what are the things that you need to be able to do, or what are the things you are most fearful about? And it might link back to the injury mechanism as well. And even though they might want to, put on the brave face and say, no, I'm not worried about that, I've seen it in the athletes that have had those major injuries. Whether it's a subconscious thing, when they get into that situation, you can see the hesitation, or they might change the way that they do things. So you really have to keep digging and progressing towards those higher level movements and skills.
What a great answer. Sounds like you're considering from a research perspective, as well as a player and a coach and a practitioner, that person's whole life. You're thinking about their health across their lifespan. You're not just thinking about getting them back to an endpoint return to sport. You're thinking about the impact of the current sport and what they're doing on the future joint health and them as a person.
And that's something we, Adam and I have spoken a lot about with some of our trials is, and it's come up from clinicians as well, is, do you talk about arthritis? Do you talk about all this bad stuff that might happen or might not in the future? And always the concern from clinicians is that it might cause more fear and catastrophization within the patient. But I think if you do it in the right way, it's just really important information for that person, because what we saw at 5 years when a lot of these patients were coming back is when they started to get maybe some symptoms, lifestyle might have changed, they've dropped off exercise and they didn't know what to do, or they weren't expecting it, and they didn't see anyone, and then, a couple of years go on and it deteriorates. So arming them before they leave you is going to help them down the track.
And that's a perfect thing to do. And I'll often do that, particularly with sports injuries that are quite severe or more sort of your chronic long terms. I'll often give patients something that they can assess. And I'll get them to assess it all the time. So whether that's hip range of motion, knee range of motion, something like knee to wall for the ankle, and I'll get them to assess it every day. And that way they will know what their ankle, knee, hip, you might do a shoulder, like a push-up or something. But if they do it every day, then they'll know the subtleties of when it's starting to not feel so good. And then they have the opportunity to see if they can improve it by some simple exercises, stretches, and then reassess and see if that has improved it. And if it's improved it, great. But if it hasn't improved it, then they know that when they're playing sport or they're going to training, they know they need to sort of back off a little bit. And then the other thing that I tell them is, if you can't settle this down yourself within a week, that's the time to go and see me again or see someone. So exactly what you're saying. So letting them know that flare-ups of injuries is normal, especially when, you're feeling good, you tend to sometimes overdo it, and just knowing what to do. And like you said, Brooke, sometimes the lifestyle changes, family might be an issue, you might start a family and now your time that you used to take for going for long runs, although in our instance, Luke, when we had babies, decided to take up ultra marathon running.
I was going to say, not in your household. You make the kids run laps of marathons around your house.
Henry ran 6Ks with me last night. What's that in miles for our North American friends?
Yeah.
Don't know.
Well, he did 10Ks with me the other week. So.
He's only 9 years old. So, hey, he is his idea, everyone, before you get into us about making our kids do this. He loves it.
No, it's a good point, Zuzana. Like for the knees, you can easily patients with gym equipment can test themselves with like a, 3-5 RM on a leg extension or a hamstring curl, or what are they squatting? What can they hop? There's so many different things you can do. And we know from the literature as well that actually like strength and function shouldn't really start to deteriorate until after you're, 40, 50. So yeah, people might kind of think, oh, well, I'm just getting older, I'm getting weaker. There's no reason why you can't maintain or even continue to improve your strength in that kind of sporting age.
It's a really important message, yeah.
And that's an important, yeah, exactly. That's an important message, because there's a lot of research out there, or this is mainly previous research, where they show, a decrease in strength, decrease in endurance, all these sorts of figures. But what they're doing is when you look at the population, this is a population that did become more sedentary when they're, going into older age. So what did you expect? But there is some nice research showing that, a lot of these strength, power, endurance, all those sorts of measures, if you continue to work them, yes, you'll get older, and yes, you may decline a bit, but it may not be that significant compared to those that do take the low road and sort of withdraw a little bit and do more sedentary lifestyles.
Yeah, I think as well with the ACL injured population, especially the adolescents, and we know they're like at a higher risk, particularly women and girls, is they might not come from a background where they've participated in resistance training. So it's not going to be a natural thing for them to continue. They'll do it for their rehab. It's not going to be natural for them to continue it after that. And then there's many reasons for that. It's a societal thing of, women and girls being in the gym. But that's another tip, I think, is to understand like what people enjoy, how they would like to do their rehab, what are some of the barriers that might exist for a young girl, getting in the gym.
And that's what we're going to talk about on part 2 of our conversation. It's going to come out next week. We're going to record it now. And I think it would be remiss of me not to mention one of the big topics we're going to talk about in next week's episode, which is the Women in Sport Congress. And I only bring it up now because isn't the deadline for abstract submission very soon? We should mention it this week, right?
On Monday, the 13th of June, early bird registration's closed. So, yeah, okay. It's a really exciting Congress. It's a Women in Sport Congress. We've partnered with the Australian Institute of Sport, and it's bringing together national, international experts in practitioners and people working in community to elite with female athletes. So there's kind of 6 broad topics, and I'm hoping I'm going to be able to remember them all off the top of my head, but injury prevention rehab is one of them. That's my area. Pelvic health, breast health and pregnancy. There's menstrual health and its impact on injury and performance. There's leadership and inclusion. There's women of all abilities. And Zuzana, help me out here.
There is some strength and conditioning
and
in there
strength,
as well.
performance and coaching. How could I forget? So there'll be keynote speakers in each of those. We're calling for case presentations. So clinicians who might have had an interesting case can submit, researchers in those areas can submit abstracts, and it's really modest pricing compared to other sports medicine conferences. So yeah, definitely check it out, and we'll pop the link in the website.
Excellent. Let's go into details of the origin of that, and then some of the presentations, and then more broadly women and girls in sport in the next episode. Brooke, we really appreciate the work that you do. You're, for example, the British Journal of Sports Medicine podcast team. You're a part of that podcast team and host there. All the work you're doing in LASM, all of your PhD work, it's making a big difference, making a big impact for people, because 20 years ago when I started, none of this existed. We're really in the dark about a lot of the topics you've been talking about today. And it's also really good to have Zuzana and you going back and forward with your clinical experience and application of some of the research you've been talking about. So let's leave it there. And thank you very much for coming on for a chat.
Cheers. Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Zuzana.
And so listeners, if you found this interesting, as I'm sure you have, please share the episode. Tag us in at Perraton Physio, and then you can find all the links to all the things that Brooke and Zuzana have mentioned in the show notes. So click on that, and you can find links to this episode to share it on our website, perraton.physio. So thanks very much, Brooke and Zuzana, for a really interesting chat today. And until next time, this is Brooke, Zuzana, and Luke wishing you all the very best with your studying, professional development, and lifelong learning.